Just live from Addis Ababa. Meanwhile, the EU says it will slap further sanctions on Russia if need be. The bloc urged Moscow to use its influence on militias in eastern Ukraine to stick to a recent truce agreement.
Sanctions against Russia will not be lifted until something really good happens on the ground. And on the other side, we are always ready to increase the pressure if needed.
Mogherini says EU's first priority is to boost the Franco-German ceasefire with more robust missions on the ground in eastern Ukraine. She stressed that both Kiev and militias are positively cooperating to implement the deal's points by pulling back their heavy weapons and not violating it. But she said that there are still some breaches of the Minsk Agreement. The EU and the US have imposed sanctions on Russia. The Kremlin, though, denies any involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine and says sanctions are somehow a blessing in disguise, although they have done their damage too. To discuss that a bit further, and I joined Mr. Mike Billington, who is with the Asia Desk at the Executive Intelligence Review, and he's joining us live now via Skype from Leesburg. Mr. Billington, thanks for joining us here on Press TV. I'm wondering at this point, a lot of talk once again, of sanctions, the threat of sanctions at least hanging over the head. Will that come to pass, do you think?
Well, it could very well. It's clear that Obama and his hit lady, Victoria Nuland, are doing everything they can to sabotage the Minsk Agreement. They immediately announced preparation for new sanctions, and they, of course, are mobilizing to send weapons into to Kiev, which the Russians have made very clear would be an act of war. And I think it has to be noted that, first of all, the reason the Minsk II took place is because Hollande and Merkel worked without collaboration with Obama or the British, but in fact worked directly, recognizing that we were on the brink of a new war in Europe that in fact could very well be a global war with Russia. And they recognized the insanity of that and moved rapidly to implement the Minsk II Accord. There was I think what I've described as a Nuremberg rally in Washington on Wednesday this week, where Victoria Nuland testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and Kasparov and Saakashvili testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And in an atmosphere of warmongering and hysteria that is really incomprehensible, there's all-out calls for preparing the U.S. military, moving NATO to the Russian borders, sending weapons, heavy weapons, lethal weapons into Ukraine, and so on. All, of course, blamed on Putin. Coming right after the visit of Parubi, who is one of the founders of the right sector, one of the overt, publicly, personally proud Nazis in Ukraine, in the Kiev government, who was brought over to the U.S. by Victoria Nuland, pranced around Washington, demanding weapons for what they describe as an all-out war with Russia. This is the potential of a nuclear war, which we are on the brink of today. The Russians have responded extremely strongly. General Bourbon, head of the strategic forces, has reiterated publicly that the fantasy in the West that there could be a limited nuclear war, that they could somehow use their global strike, prompt global strike policy to take out Russia's retaliatory capacity is a fantasy, an illusion, and that they are prepared to unleash a full-scale nuclear attack if they are attacked, as being threatened by the spokesman for Obama and Victoria Nuland in Ukraine.
Just briefly, if you can, Mr. Billington, when you refer to the EU's stance earlier, and of course, as you rightly said, Hollande and Merkel were the ones who brought forth, of course, Minsk II. Does that mean that now we're seeing the gap between the U.S. and the Europeans grow over Russia?
A huge gap. This is being driven by the financial breakdown in Europe. The fact that Greece finally stood up and said that we are not going to kill our people to maintain this unpayable debt is spreading panic throughout the financial interests in the West. The true nations, as represented by what Hollande and Merkel did in forging this peace agreement, are aware that that there is a direct connection between this financial breakdown crisis in the West and Russia's collaboration with Asia, with China, and with the BRICS on great development projects. And this connection is the key to how we have to stop this war. We have to move rapidly to impose the financial transformation in the West, Glass-Steagall and things I've discussed here before, to end this financial dictatorship and identify the fact that this rush for war can only be met by getting Europe and the United States, for that matter, to join with the BRICS nations on development projects on a global scale. But it's a very dangerous situation. We're potentially days away from a war. The ceasefire is holding, as you know, and yet the Obama administration and his British sponsors are hysterically preparing for new sanctions, for sending the weapons in, and are just itching for a chance to say that Russia is breaking the Minsk Accords. And to, whether it's true or not, just as in the Nemtsov murder, they immediately denounced or pronounced, without any evidence whatsoever, that Putin did it. Clearly, the Nemtsov murder was an attack on Putin. It was a frame-up of Putin, an attempt to justify the continued push for war and regime change policies against Russia as well as against Ukraine.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. But as always, of course, we do appreciate your insight. That was Mr. Mike Billington, who was speaking to us live from Leesburg.